Hello there. Greetings. Greetings and salutations. God knows how many hundreds of videos I've made speaking about the conjugate geometry of the universe. And I've spoken about it endlessly. Sometimes, usually actually, people need a more simple methodology to visualize things. And of course I have talked endlessly about a donut shape, a hyperboloid, and a torus. Respectively, of course, a hyperboloid is an hourglass shape, and a torus, of course, is a donut shape. And of course, these are the negative images of one another. They are two things that are one thing. Magnetism is, as Faraday said, the dielectric field. We could make a very simple analogy, and I've done this before, saying that ice is the modality of water, with, of course, a temperature variable applicable to it, such that human beings love, of course, to pigeonhole things. You know, ice, water, and steam are not three different things, as I've said endlessly. They're one thing only differentiated out, but different temperature and pressure modalities. And of course, everything in nature is pressure mediation. Try to keep things really simple here and state something in a video that I've not stated before, and it makes it very simple. And of course, simplicity, as I've said, is divinity. Now, we've all seen what a fountain is. A fountain, of course, would be like a spring. Of course, most fountains, virtually all fountains that human beings see, of course, are artificial. Water comes up and it actually creates this jet. And of course, a water jet, or in the case of a spring, of course, when spring water bubbles up, it doesn't usually have high pressure. Sometimes it does. I've actually seen this, and it's quite rare. But in Las Vegas or other places that have water fountains, you're actually looking at, of course, half of a hyperboloid. Water springing up from the ground from a pressure device. What if, in visualizing, and visualization helps people understand things very simply. And there are two dimensions and two dimensions only in the universe. One is spatial and one is counterspatial. We think, of course, as time as a dimension, and that's not true. Time is not a dimension. Time is a measure of mass and magnitude. People think, well, there's 4 dimensions, possibly 5. So no, there's only 2 dimensions. Spatial and counterspatial. Mother Nature is not so complicated. She's a hippie chick with muddy feet and hairy pits. As I've said humorously before, Mother Nature doesn't have so many dimensions. There's only the dimension of force and motion, inertia and acceleration. Specifically, of course, these are relational to the geometry of the creation of space, i.e. the geometry of the torus. And space, of course, is the after effect of a divergent magnetic field. And the counter dimension, or dimension towards non-Cartesian ultimate reality, the foundation from which everything must thence spring, because there's a difference between nothing and not a thing. And this is a really fine point that is accurately talked about in true metaphysics, both Greek, Indian, and Egyptian. Okay, nothing is one thing, not a thing is another. Not a thing means it is not phenomena. What's the opposite of phenomena? That would be noumena. We would say metaphysics, we could say the realm of subspace, we could say the realm of spirituality. But of course we have the dimensions of spatial and counterspatial. We have the dimensions of the torus and the hyperboloid. Each one is a negative image of one another. The torus is a negative image of a hyperboloid, and the hyperboloid is a negative image of a torus. But each one is half of the other. And speaking about whence or thence or how come, we would look for a first cause or original sin, but that, of course, is completely denied in monistic monism, both Greek, Indian, and Egyptian, but that's a matter for another discussion. And the reason why I say sink and spring in referring to this conjugate geometry, I'm going to paint a simple picture for you, is since they both start with an S and it kind of makes things easy to remember. We can imagine this non-Cartesian point, or a point anywhere to imagine it within your head, to actually develop a picture within your mind as to this geometry. Imagine with no feed lines and nothing that's visible, we have a spring in And we can't say in a space, because space can't come before the actual manifestation. Space is the after effect of a divergent field, so we can't say in space. But just imagine a point which, wherein which, by which, and from which the release of energy occurs, and then we have a spring. Yes? Like a fountain. In this case, of course, force necessitates a three-dimensional S vector, a three-dimensional force vector. So imagine a spring, a point in your mind that actually emanates from one point, wherein which the spring is emanating both this way, and we actually have the hyperboloidal geometry that defines increasing inertia and acceleration, but that is the negative image of the torus. If we could actually superimpose these two things on one another, we've all seen a sink. Yeah, like the sink in your bathtub, a sink in your shower. You know, you pull the plug on the drain and a vortex starts to develop. I'm talking about a sink. Yes? Everybody, I think, understands what a sink is. It is a depression whereby which pressure is released, because everything is pressure mediation. Yes? And by the way, a vortex is only half of half of a hyperboloid. That was difficult to say there for a second. Because if you take half of an hourglass, have you ever turned over an hourglass and seen the sands create this sink as it actually sinks? In the case of a true hourglass, it sinks to the bottom. In the case of Mother Nature's hourglass, it sinks towards the thinnest, most constricted point at the center of an hourglass, the plane of inertia, the actual point of which, and of course we can't say reference of point. This is why words become insufficient. We actually have to understand geometry and non-Cartesian reality, or counter space, or subspace, or 0 point energy. It doesn't matter what anybody calls it. But the sands of Mother Nature, of course, sink towards counter space, the release of that energy or inertia. So we have to have in our mind's eye, and it has to be pictured in our mind's eye. There's not even a single diagram that I could show you that would illustrate it better. The superimposition of a torus and a hyperboloid. What is the lowest pressure mediation, whereby which, if we can imagine, I am coming very quickly to the point, and so nobody talks about stuff like this. It's hard for me to say it such that you could visualize it in your head, so I'm doing a first here. You know, nobody's written about this in any book, be it Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, not Nikola Tesla, not James Clerk Maxwell, not even Charles Proteus Steinmetz or Heaviside, so I have to be careful how I say this. Imagine one geometry where two geometries are fighting each other. What is the lowest pressure mediation of our sink spring? Our sink and spring, I mean specifically, is that we have the release of pressure, the manifestation, the creation of space. We have the inflation of the donut, if you will, the torus that is magnetism. Magnetism, of course, is centrifugal divergence. Magnetism is the creation of space, whereby which the hourglass or the hyperboloid is fighting with, in a roundabout sense I'm speaking, with the torus. They both occupy one unified geometry because they are not two different things. Magnetism and dielectricity, or space and counter space, are not two different things. They're one thing. As Faraday said, magnetism is the dielectric field. Of course, completely accurate. You know, there's not if we have a block of ice, it is not something different that the water results from when the ice heats up. They are one thing. They are one entity occupying one unific geometry. I hate to use the word unific because it's not typical English language that people today use. But we have to, in our mind's eye, imagine a double-sided spring, yes, shaped like a hourglass or a hyperboloid, occupying and both being one and the same thing, as the inflationary and also, too, simultaneously deflationary torus. They are both operating in perpetuity, conjoined forever and ever, because they are one and the exact same thing. So we have, and this is hard to picture, and it is hard for me to say this without confusing people, a geometry of a sink and a spring. Okay? Our spring, of course, would be the hourglass shape, and our sink would be, our spring would be the torus. I'm always thinking 10 steps ahead, so let me Start that over just for a second. Our spring, of course, would be the inflationary torus, and our sink, of course, would be the decreasing hyperboloid. These are always perpetually forever fighting one another. And by the way, this is actually how you explain a black hole. This is how you explain why a more powerful magnet has a smaller spatial magnetic field. But why do I buy this really powerful magnet, but the spatial field around it is smaller? It's because when you hold a super powerful magnet, and I have many of them, really powerful ones, as powerful as they come, the spatial field of the magnetic influence around it is quite small, because a magnet is more a dielectric device than it is a magnetic device. In other words, it is, imagine if you, like as I've said this before, you increase the pressure on your shower. Now a shower doesn't work this way. If you increase the pressure or outflow of the shower, what happens is a multiplicative suction, and this doesn't happen in a shower, but it happens in the case of a magnet, that the drain pressure increases, it pulls the water back in. This is the reason why a really powerful magnet has a small spatial field. You see, magnetism and dielectricity are not two different things. This unific geometry of our sink spring, and I like to call it a sink and a spring because they're both one and the same thing. We only differentiate them because, well, this is magnetism, it is inflationary, it's centrifugal divergence, and of course it represents the geometry of the torus, or the donut. And this is the geometry of increasing inertia and acceleration, or centripetal convergence, or the hyperboloid, wherein which Mother Nature's sands, if you will, or the energy, doesn't go from one side of the hourglass to the other like it does in a conventional hourglass, which we've all seen and I have several hourglasses. It actually moves and vanishes completely at that no little center point. Yes, and it's not a point. It's a portal to counter space. That would be a most accurate description. Mother Nature's sands of energy pressure mediation move to complete invisibility and disappears back into counter space. And this is what ether is by definition, is always in counter space, because a field is only an ether perturbation modality. It is in which, whereby which, the ether is made manifest through a modality wherein which it is disturbed. Just like an AC generator, just like magnetism. Magnetism is the extrinsic nature of the dielectric. It is a disturbance to the loss of energy or inertia as manifesting an inflationary toroidal force vector. And all of Mother Nature's force vectors are not two-dimensional. They're three-dimensional. Yes, and they are a move away from counter space. The release of energy or inertia is a three-dimensional S-curve. What's a three-dimensional S-curve? It's the extrapolation of the interior geometry of a torus. If you actually took a piece of wire and bent each took a piece of wire and bent it like an S, and you bent each end inverse to one another, you have the interior geometry of a torus geometry. I just made myself redundant by saying geometry twice. Humbly apologize. Once again, this is what happens when you think about 10 things at once. But I don't know if it's so easy for people to understand or visualize in one unific simplex geometry, the superimposition of which we have two things: force and motion, inertia and acceleration. Specifically, the geometry of the dielectric and the magnetic, i.e. the hyperboloid and the torus, occupying one simplex. Well, it's not simplex. It actually is simplex. I see it very, very simply. But other people have difficulty seeing this. If we could imagine a two-headed spring of inflation, but also two superimposed over that two-headed, because if you look at a donut, yeah, we have the hole at the top of the donut, and we flip the donut over, we have another hole, and of course we could look at this as a vortex sink, yeah, just like the sink in your drain and the sink in your bathtub, where these two geometries are fighting one another, but they are in perfect harmony with one another. They always, always have instantaneous homeostasis. Always instantaneous homeostasis, because they are one and the same thing. So what I'm trying to get you to do, because if you understand this, you understand, literally, and I don't say this in any exaggeration, you understand 95% of Mother Nature. That's not an exaggeration. If you can visualize this, and I have difficulty saying this because it's hard for me to say this and to convey to you the visualization of same, and no one's done this before in field theory. Like I said, not Tesla, not Aristotle or Plato or anybody else. But we have a sink-spring unific geometry whereby which the geometry of force and motion, inertia and acceleration, the geometry of the torus, is superimposed over the hyperboloid, and the hyperboloid is superimposed right over top of it, because they're the negative images of one another, and it's the conjugate geometry of the universe. But in easier visualization, everybody knows what a spring is like. If you go to a hotel or something, you know how this fountain springing out, and of course the fountain is like the inverse of a vortex. If you actually reversed a vortex, which of course is movement towards counter space and movement towards lowest pressure mediation, we'd have the opposite. That would be a fountain. Now imagine a two-headed fountain. Of course, the release of that energy or inertia, but we also, too, at the same time, have the superimposition of the dissipation of that energy, whereby which the fountain were to reverse course, and that's kind of incorrect, release its own pressure mediation and follow the curvilinear increasing inertia and acceleration, or the centripetal dissipation of energy. So we have both centripetal convergence and centrifugal divergence operating simultaneously in really in perfect pressure mediation, both dissipation and manifestation. And this really is almost getting into metaphysics, but there's no distinction between physics and metaphysics. But I'm trying to convey this to you, and I hope I'm not being too obtuse. I just want people to picture in their mind's eye a double-headed fountain and a dissipating sink, superimposed as one unific entity. And this is the reason why I'm not making things more complicated. I'm trying to make them more simple. A spring sink. So we have a double-headed spring, and we have a double-headed sink. They're not double-headed. It's literally a three-dimensional force vector that self-dissipates. It's both manifesting and anti-manifesting. And this is, by the way, is exactly what you see underneath the ferrocell. It's very, very, very simple, but amazingly enough, it's so simple, and I can see it very, very clearly, and I dream about it, and I think about it all the time. It is the most simple thing in the universe that I've ever seen, both in my mind's eye and otherwise, and yet at the same time so incredibly, incredibly difficult to convey to somebody else. I don't know if it's the people don't, and no, none of us do. You know, think of terms of pressure mediation vis-a-vis spatial and counterspatial and conjugate geometries, an inseparable unific whole or wholeness. Kind of like a hologram, by the way. We actually have the reflectance, which gives definition to the manifestation, and we have the reference beam, which of course they both are necessary for one another to exist. They are a conjugate wholeness, or holos. And this is the conjugate geometry of the entire universe from one end to the next. And if you can able to visualize it while you're taking a shower or soaking in the tub, if you can understand that and visualize that geometry, then you'll understand most of Mother Nature. You know, there is not magnetism over here and dielectricity over here. They are one and the exact same thing. It's really the most beautiful thing in the universe, at least to me. You could say otherwise. People could fabricate this in their head and they thought it's not beautiful at all. But if it's not beautiful to you all, then the only thing that you've done is visualize it without truly understanding it. To me, it's incredibly, it is the most beautiful thing in the universe. And it's the basis for absolutely everything. And these are not two different things. And there is no duality in the universe. There are no dualities in nature. It's completely impossible for there to be a duality in nature. There's no distinction between force and motion, inertia and acceleration. These are distinctions without a difference, whereby which we differentiate out principle and attribute. It'd be like differentiating out light and illumination. Well, light is one thing and illumination is another. Hence, light is a dual nature. People in quantum love to paint nature as dual, specifically light. They think they know what light is. They have no idea what light is. Well, light's both a particle and a wave. It's dual. That's completely ridiculous. There's no such thing as a wave anyway, because a wave is what something does, not what something is. Nor is light a wave-particle duality. But anyway, I get off topic on that one. I'm just trying to get people to, and this is really difficult. You know, the first person to do this, if you say, well, you You know, you might complain about this video as far as how I'm trying to approach it, but no one's ever done this before. You can't find it in any book or video. It's a simple sink spring, both of which are one and the exact same thing, and they both mediate themselves out. If you understand force and motion, inertia, and acceleration of the conjugate geometry of the universe, specifically the hyperboloid and the torus, both of which are the negative images of one another, but both are one and the exact same thing. It is the mediation of this pressure and the manifestation of the loss of that energy, which of course gives rise to magnetism. And when we have magnetism, we have divergence, and we have divergence, we have the creation of space. But space is not a thing at all, as Nikola Tesla famously said. He said that space has attributes but no properties. And he's correct. Space is not a thing any more than a shadow is a thing. Space and shadow are the exact same thing. A shadow is not a thing at all. Neither is space anything at all, nor can it act upon anything. This is the fallacy, of course, of relativity. And these are not my words, these are the words of Nikola Tesla. And Nikola Tesla is right. I hope I didn't convolute things in this video, but it is really difficult to talk about this and try to project comprehension into the minds of others regarding something that is divinely simple, yet incredibly complex to relate. But it is nothing other than a unific sink spring of pressure mediation vis-a-vis the magnetic and the dielectric, and it is the conjugate geometry and the ultimate secret of the entire universe. It's not my opinion, that's a fact. Anyway, I hope I didn't wax poetic and get too verbose in this video, but maybe I did. I'll read your, since I read every comment, I'll read your complaint in the comments below this video. I hated what you said. I don't know. So difficult to relate to people. I have perfect clarity of what it is, and yet relating it is just completely impossible. Not completely impossible, it's really difficult. Thank you.